To speak more on this, I do want to bring in Navy Reserve Intelligence Officer and former White House Senior Advisor Paul Chabot to talk about the very latest developments. And Paul, I appreciate you taking the time to join us here on Live Now from Fox.
Yeah, my pleasure. Great update. Happy to answer questions. Things are turning every 24 hours.
A lot of developments continue. I did want to start with this. President Trump speaking to reporters aboard Air Force One, stating that he is not interested in negotiating an end to the conflict, stating the war might only end once Iran's military and rulers have been wiped out. I wanted to ask you from that perspective, how does one accomplish that? President Trump did previously indicate that he was looking at perhaps a 4 to 6 week timeline for the conflict, although he left the door open for possibly an extended period of time.
Look, it's clear America and Israel are really winning, not only necessarily in the air, which is what you need to control, but at sea as well. What's interesting is when Iran had mentioned that they have a new president, they did not mention that potential new leader by name, which is interesting because it says a lot that if you can't name your leader of your own country, it shows how much in danger their leadership feels. We're sort of moving into a second phase, almost third phase now in this war. Initially, we want to make sure we get as many of the missiles, destroy any ability of their Navy, which we have done. But now what you're seeing is Israel going into another phase. They're going after police stations. They're going after fuel storage. And hearing Trump's confidence on the plane, I think really signals the confidence of where we are as a nation, how our military feels, and quite honestly, how I think the world as of today sees how this war is going.
You were talking about the different phases, and that was actually going to be my next question, because we were hearing from Secretary Hegseth as well as General Kane earlier in the week talking about the next phase of Operation Epic Fury. Can you break down for our viewers the difference between phase 1 and 2, and then also looking ahead, what might phase 3 look like?
Yeah, so in the military, you have different courses of action. It all depends on what's happening at the moment. So it's hard to project exactly where we will go. And obviously, I have no insight into that realm anymore. But historically, number one, you want to secure the airspace. We announced that, I think, 4 days ago, that we now have total control of the airspace. We've eliminated about 90% of their missile capability. The concern now going forward is what Iran has a lot of and is able still to develop, which are drones. Those suicide drones are extremely effective, but we also want to help look at local populations, the people that want to stand up against their regime, but who then would target those civilians in Iran. And a lot of that entity would be the police force, which is sort of interesting. When you look at how Iran as a nation was recreated after 1979, it developed itself to be a very resilient nation. Unlike when you think about taking on World War II and Hitler and cutting off the head of the snake, that's not necessarily the same here when we talk about Iran. They have various tiers. And so we're also looking at a worldwide ideology. I will say, look, this looks now like it's going great, but the big concerns right now, the Strait of Hormuz, the economic impact, suicide impacts, terrorists around the globe, I anticipate those things are going to tick up absolutely in the weeks ahead.
You know, you were talking about drones that Iran has, and I did want to ask you about that in terms of how much of a weapons supply Iran has right now, and the different, defensive and offensive mechanisms that they currently have in place. How long might this last for them?
Well, they really don't have much defensive left. When you control the airspace, that is so critical. Obviously, we're not putting boots on the ground, but that would have been another phase in a more sort of historical war. But the drones are cheap. And you've got to think about this also on a global perspective. Right now, you still have Russia and Ukraine fighting, but Russia was getting a lot of their drone technology from Iran. So right now, Russia's not getting that same pipeline to be able to attack Ukraine. So that is a victory on that side. But we're also now going after the places that can manufacture. So, for example, we're going to go after the oil, the fuel depots as much as we can, manufacturing sites. However, the difficulty with drones is that these are so cheap to make maybe $20,000, $30,000, and many of them are one-way drones, suicide drones, and a lot of the attacks we see right now happening in Kuwait earlier this morning, they're hitting fuel supplies. And so it is very difficult to get our arms around all of these smaller tactical type drones, especially the ones that are going out in masses.
So when we take a look at this and we see the strategies for Iran and the retaliation that they're focusing on, how does that change the U.S. military strategy, if at all?
Yeah, I don't think it does at this point. And I also will say Israel's in the driver's seat. Historically, we have to remember is Mossad the equivalent in many ways when we look at it to the CIA on the intel that they've been collecting on Iran. And they've been doing it for decades. When you think back after the October 7th attack and the months that led afterwards and the successful operations that Mossad had in Iran and other parts of the globe going after those that killed Israeli civilians, that we're in a phase now where it's not just the United States, where we are really safe for the large part here at home, but Israel's looking at this from a completely different perspective. They do not want to see Iran continue in the same fashion because they look at it as still almost their next door neighbor that has the ability to strike them in the future. So they want to eliminate every single possibility and option on the table to bring Iran absolutely to their knees. And that's why it's so important that President Trump signaled an unconditional surrender.
You know, you were talking about Israel. The initial strike was the United States and Israel working in tandem with Operation Epic Fury and Operation Roaring Lion. When it comes to taking a look at the next phases, we were hearing Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu stating that there will be many surprises yet to come in this conflict. The continuing communication and the continuing tandem operations, how does that, work? Are they still working in tandem, or are these now more separate operations between the two countries?
No, we're absolutely working together. These operations were planned together. They're going to continue to coordinate together. But there's also deconfliction, which when you have so many military assets in the air, in the water, from two nations, we are absolutely sharing information back and forth to worry about deconfliction of our own forces accidentally shooting down each other, which, as we know, has already happened in one of the Gulf states with one of our American jets. So the deconfliction is happening because we're sharing intel, we're sharing information. And quite honestly, when you think about the military perspective, when we plan for wars, we think about what are called the 5 Eyes of how we share information with our allies. This is not one of those sort of wars. This is where it is the United States and Israel that has taken on a significant leadership role in the Middle East at significant risk and has been extremely successful. Now, success brings the loss of life. We've lost 6 United States service members, huge loss. But in the totality of where we are, Iran has lost over 1,000 plus at this point, and we've lost 6. Not that it's a numbers game, prayers to the family and those. But overall, this is a very successful operation thus far.
And Paul, I also wanted to ask you this because Iran's not just targeting U.S. and Israeli locations and facilities. The governments of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE, as well as Bahrain, reporting Iranian drone attacks in their countries yesterday and early this morning. You know, as we take a look at this, and Iran is now targeting some of the countries there in the Middle East, how does that change, if at all, the United States strategy, Israel strategy? Are they solely focusing on Iran, or might this also then, the footprint, might that grow as well?
It's interesting because Iran recently, in the last 24 hours, basically apologized to the Gulf states, saying, we apologize. We didn't mean to hit you. We didn't intend to hit you. But at the same time, it shows the disruption in Iran when they are targeting Gulf state oil refineries, when you see random lobs at other locations. What it shows us is a complete disorganization within their military leadership. And what we should watch going forward is if there is a leader that rises in Iran. Now, remember, Israel wants to wipe out every single leader that they feel is going to be an adversary. Where we will see things change is if there is a leader that is selected or brought forward through their own revolution within their nation, then you begin to see the United States and Israel having discussions about how to work. But right now, we're nowhere near that phase. You have a lot of loyalists. You have an ideology which is wrapping their arms around Iran, and they don't want to go down. They do not want to give up what they have. And so the protections of what we can do by controlling the airspace and continuing to control that the best we can, working to see if the citizens can rise up and take over their own country, or there is a leader put in place that provides unconditional surrender. I see those as the only two ways going forward for this to be resolved.
And Paul, I want to go back to a point that you brought up in the very beginning. You know, Iran has said that they are very close to announcing the next leader, but they haven't yet named that person. Yeah. You know, can you talk about the significance of that? As you also mentioned, that there looks to be some fractions within the ruling party right now. Who currently is in charge, and could those cracks grow as the days go on?
So power in Iran, it's spread amongst these multiple institutions. You've got the Revolutionary Guard. You have a formal successional mechanisms. All these have been put in place since 1979. You have parallel security forces, intelligence, law enforcement, paramilitary, IRCG. But then you have this ideology. And so by Iran not mentioning the name of their leader, I can only tell you that from the military intel perspective and everybody else involved in this, we see that as a great sign of weakness, but it shows our strength because they don't want to get their next leader killed right away. And Israel has made it absolutely crystal clear that we're going to continue to follow the lead with the United States. Unless unconditional surrender, we are not going to stop. The pressure is going to keep going.
Paul, before we let you go, is there anything specific that you're keeping a very close eye on as we are now in the next phase of Operation Epic Fury?
Yeah, a few things. Let's watch the Strait of Hormuz. For your viewers out there, that is a choke point where about 20% of the world's oil comes from. Huge economic impact. Thankfully, the United States is largely energy independent, although our gas prices are up 15, 20, 40 cents, depending where you are. Watch the Strait of Hormuz. The United States and our allies have been very cognizant of that. Also, interesting to watch what we are using for new technology or even old technology. We used a old school Mark torpedo with upgraded technology that blew up an Iranian frigate that was in international waters that was coming back from doing exercises with Russia and China. Watch Russia and China right now. They have not indicated any willingness to get involved militarily. However, Russia right now is losing a friend, but we also know they are active in sharing intelligence on U.S. operations to the best that they can to the Iranians. So watch these pieces play. Watch how our adversaries, China, Russia, stay in the background, potentially try to use the UN in the weeks ahead if this drags on to a degree to where we see more loss of life, or if we begin to see suicide attacks on our embassies and other Americans across the globe. That's what's to watch.
All right, Paul Chabot, as always, we appreciate you joining us here on Live Now from Fox.
Thank you. God bless.